Officer, I am going to give you one last opportunity. If you proceed, I assure you, it will be the single greatest regret of your professional life.
You're in no position to be giving anyone a chance. Shut up. I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by some jailhouse lawyer. Stand up, turn around and put your hands behind your back. Now.
The morning sun, pale and winter-thin, cast long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns of Crestwood Park. It was a Tuesday, a day of no particular importance, which was precisely why Samuel Grayson cherished it. At 68 years old, Grayson had earned a lifetime's supply of quiet Tuesdays. He sat on his preferred bench, the one nearest the willow tree whose branches wept over the edge of the pond. The air was crisp, carrying the clean, earthy scent of frost-bitten grass and damp soil. Beside him on the cold iron slats sat a small, grease-stained paper bag filled with a mix of cracked corn and sunflower seeds. For the ducks, the geese, and the audacious squirrels, it was a feast. For Grayson, it was a ritual, a form of meditation that anchored his days. He wore a heavy, dark gray wool overcoat, a garment that had served him faithfully for over a decade. It was comfortable, warm, and utterly devoid of style. A simple black beanie was pulled down over his ears, shielding them from the persistent chill. His trousers were loose, functional, and his shoes were sturdy, sensible things made for walking, not for making an impression. To the casual observer, he was just an old man, another fixture of the park, blending into the scenery as seamlessly as the oak trees and the wrought iron trash cans. There was nothing about him to suggest a past filled with screaming sirens, the crushing weight of command, or the intricate, often brutal politics of a major metropolitan police department. There was nothing to betray the fact that for 35 years he had worn a badge, and for the last 10 of those years he had been the man at the very top, Police Commissioner Samuel Grayson, a name that once made mayors tremble and criminals curse. Now his world had shrunk to the size of this pond, his concerns narrowed to the well-being of its feathered inhabitants. He reached into the bag, his large, weathered hand scooping up a handful of seeds. With a gentle, practiced flick of his wrist, he scattered the grain across the frozen ground near the water's edge. A flurry of activity erupted. Mallards, their iridescent green heads gleaming in the sun, waddled forward with comical urgency. A squadron of Canadian geese, imperious and loud, honked their approach. Grayson smiled, a faint, contented expression that softened the hard lines of his face. This was order. This was a system that made sense. You offer something, and the world responds with simple, honest gratitude. There was no deceit, no hidden agenda, just the purity of need and provision. He had spent his career navigating a world painted in shades of gray, a world where right and wrong were often tangled into an unrecognizable knot. He had made decisions that cost men their careers and others their lives. He had stared down the barrels of guns and the even more frightening lens of a news camera during a citywide crisis. He had carried the burden of 1,000 secrets, 1,000 failures, and 1,000 small, uncelebrated victories. He had seen the very worst of humanity, the casual cruelty and the calculated evil that people inflict upon one another. And he had seen the best, the selfless bravery of an officer running toward danger, the quiet compassion of a detective comforting a victim's family, the unwavering resilience of a community determined to heal. He had retired 3 years ago, not because he was tired of the fight, but because he knew when it was time for a new generation to take the reins. He had handed over his badge, his office, and the immense weight of responsibility to his hand-picked successor. He had walked out of the monolithic headquarters for the last time, not with a sense of loss, but with a profound feeling of release. He had done his duty. Now, his only duty was to himself, to reclaim the peace he had so often sacrificed for the sake of the city. This park, this bench, this simple act of feeding the birds, it was his sanctuary. It was where the ghosts of his past fell silent and the noise of the world faded into a distant hum. He breathed in the cold, clean air, his breath a white plume in the stillness. He was invisible. He was at peace. But peace, as he knew better than most, was a fragile, fleeting thing. It was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, turbulent ocean, and sometimes all it takes is a single, careless step to break the surface. He heard the distant crunch of gravel under tires, a sound that was both familiar and, in this specific context, deeply unwelcome. It was the sound of a predator, slow-rolling, hunting. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He just scattered another handful of seeds and waited. Cruiser 5 Baker 9 prowled along the park's access road like a shark gliding through shallow water. Behind the wheel, Officer Dean Miller, 29 years old with 5 years on the force, had the bored, restless energy of an athlete warming the bench. He saw his patrol sector not as a community to be served, but as a territory to be dominated. Every day was a hunt, and his stats, the number of stops, citations, and arrests, were his trophies. In the competitive, testosterone-fueled environment of the 5th Precinct, Miller was determined to be a top performer. He didn't rise through the ranks by waiting for calls to come in. He rose by generating his own action. He was a proactive cop, a go-getter. At least that's what he told himself. His detractors, the older, more jaded veterans in the locker room, had other names for him. A cowboy, a badge-heavy rookie who hadn't yet learned that the most important tool on his belt wasn't his gun, but his discretion. Miller's eyes, narrowed and perpetually skeptical, scanned the landscape. He drove slowly, his window down despite the cold, letting the sounds and smells of the park filter in. He wasn't admiring the scenery. He was looking for anomalies, for anything that seemed out of place. A group of teenagers loitering near the restrooms? Potential vandalism or drug use. A car parked in an isolated spot with steamed-up windows. A possible vice collar. He saw the world through a lens of suspicion, a place where every citizen was a potential suspect, their innocence merely a temporary state pending further investigation. It was a cynical worldview, but in Miller's mind, it was what kept him safe. It was what made him a good cop. Then he saw him, a solitary figure on a bench by the pond. Miller's internal checklist began ticking away, his brain assembling a narrative from a handful of visual cues, each one filtered through a thick layer of bias and assumption. 1. Lone male, not with a family, not jogging, not walking a dog, just sitting, suspicious. 2. Heavy, oversized coat. In this weather? Plausible, but it could also be used to conceal weapons, tools for burglary or narcotics. It was a classic tell. 3. Location. This park had seen its share of minor drug busts and complaints about vagrancy. He was in a known trouble spot. 4. Demeanor. Stillness. Too still. The man wasn't reading, wasn't on a phone, he was just watching. To Miller, it looked like the patient observation of a dealer waiting for a customer or a lookout for a crime in progress. The kaleidoscope of prejudice clicked into a clear picture. The man was black. In Miller's simplistic and dangerous calculus, this was not just a descriptor, it was a risk multiplier. It elevated the entire equation from keep an eye on him to time to make a move. He didn't see a senior citizen enjoying a quiet morning. He didn't see a retiree, a grandfather, a man who might have lived in this city his entire life. He saw a profile, a problem waiting to be solved, a potential arrest that would look good on his activity log for the day. He felt that familiar surge of adrenaline, the hunter's thrill that came just before the pounce. This was it. This was the action he'd been looking for. He pulled the cruiser over to the curb, the tires making a loud, deliberate crunch on the gravel path. It was a sound designed to announce his presence, to intimidate. He killed the engine but left the dashcam recording. He tapped his chest, a reflexive habit to ensure his body camera was active and buffering. Every step he took from this point forward would be documented, a fact that filled him not with a sense of caution, but with a sense of confidence. The cameras would prove his version of events. He stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting his face. He adjusted his duty belt, the leather creaking with a sound of authority. His hand drifted down, resting naturally, almost casually, on the grip of his Glock. It was a subconscious gesture, a power posture he had learned from watching senior officers. It was a signal, a non-verbal declaration that he was in charge before a single word had been exchanged. The silence of the park was about to be broken, and Officer Dean Miller was going to be the one to do it. He strode forward, his boots heavy on the path, his mind already playing out the script he had run 100 times before. A script that had always, until now, ended with his complete and total control of the situation. Samuel Grayson heard the car door slam shut with a hollow thud that seemed to echo across the water. He heard the rhythmic crunch of boots on the gravel path, the sound growing steadily louder, more insistent. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn his head. He continued to gaze at the ducks, his posture the very definition of calm. He knew exactly what was happening. He had been on the other side of this approach 1,000 times. He had taught the academy class on how to do it properly, with respect and de-escalation as the guiding principles. He could already tell just from the sound of the footsteps, too heavy, too fast, too aggressive, that this officer was about to fail the test. He scattered another small handful of seeds, a deliberate, placid movement. Let the officer make the first move. Let him reveal his intent. "Hey, you on the bench! Let me see your hands!" The voice cut through the tranquil morning air like a shard of glass. It was loud, sharp, and laced with an unearned authority that grated on Grayson's nerves. It was the kind of voice that assumed guilt, that expected trouble, and often, by its very nature, created it. It was a voice designed not to communicate, but to command and intimidate. Slowly, deliberately, Grayson stopped his hand mid-air. He let the last of the seeds fall from his fingers. He dusted his palms together, making sure the gesture was slow and visible. Only then did he turn his head, not his whole body, just his head, to look at the young officer who had just appointed himself the arbiter of this public space. He took in the entire picture in a single, practiced glance. The officer was young, maybe late 20s, with a short military-style haircut. His jaw was tight, his shoulders squared in a way that was more confrontational than professional. The hand was hovering near the weapon, a classic sign of an officer who was either nervous, poorly trained, or both. Grayson's eyes flicked to the nameplate, M-I-L-L-E-R. The name meant nothing to him, but the type, oh, the type he knew intimately. He had seen dozens of Officer Millers in his time, full of ego, short on wisdom, the kind of cop who saw every citizen as a nail and his badge as a hammer. "Good morning, officer," Grayson said. His voice was a low baritone, raspy with age, but steady as a rock. It was a voice that had addressed packed press conferences and calmed riotous crowds. It carried an innate authority that had nothing to do with volume. "Is there a problem?" The simple, polite question seemed to throw Miller off balance. He had expected fear, or perhaps a stammered apology, or a sullen, defiant silence. He had not expected the calm, level gaze of an equal. It irritated him. It was a deviation from his script. He strode closer, closing the distance until he was standing just a few feet away, well inside the reactionary gap he should have been maintaining. It was another mistake, another sign of aggression. He was invading Grayson's personal space, a classic tactic of intimidation. "I'll be the one asking the questions," Miller snapped, his tone sharpening. "I said, let me see your hands. Now stand up. Step away from the bench." Grayson didn't move. He simply opened his hands and placed them, palms down, on his knees, making them plainly visible. He was a portrait of non-threatening compliance. "My hands are right here, officer, and I'm quite comfortable where I am. I'm enjoying the morning. Now, you still haven't answered my question. Is there a specific problem? Have I violated a city ordinance by feeding the birds?" Miller's face began to flush, a faint pink creeping up his neck. This wasn't going according to plan. The man wasn't cowering. He wasn't giving up his ground. He was questioning him, challenging his authority with calm, precise language. This required more than just barking orders. It required a justification. And Miller, high on adrenaline and prejudice, reached for the oldest, most generic one in the book. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this park," Miller said, the lie coming easily to his lips. "Drug deals going down. You fit the description of a suspect we're looking for." Grayson's expression didn't change, but inside he felt a profound sense of disappointment. It was a lie, and a lazy one at that. A pretext stop. The first resort of a cop who has nothing but a hunch and the power of his badge. The dispatch logs would show no such report. It was a fabrication designed to justify an illegal stop, a fishing expedition. And Samuel Grayson was not about to let him get away with it. The peaceful morning was over. The sanctuary had been breached. The old man feeding the ducks was gone, and in his place, the commissioner had returned. Fit the description? Grayson repeated the words slowly, his voice dropping a half octave. He let the phrase hang in the cold air between them, exposing its hollowness. That's a rather broad statement, officer. A description of whom exactly? A black man? A man wearing a warm coat on a cold day? Could you be more specific? What crime am I suspected of committing right now sitting on this bench? The directness of the questions, the precise and logical way they dismantled Miller's flimsy pretext was like a series of quick jabs. Miller's jaw tightened even further. He was used to his authority being a shield, an unquestionable force that ended conversations before they began. He wasn't prepared for a debate, especially not one where he was so clearly on shaky legal ground. He felt his control of the situation slipping, and his frustration began to curdle into anger. "Look, old man, this isn't a game," Miller retorted, his voice rising in volume to compensate for his lack of substance. "I don't have to explain myself to you. We got a call. You match. It's that simple. Now I need to see some identification. Let me see your driver's license." Grayson remained perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees. He was a rock against which the waves of Miller's impatience were crashing. He knew the law. He hadn't just learned it, he had enforced it, shaped policy around it. He knew the precedent set by Terry versus Ohio. He knew that for an officer to demand identification, there must be a reasonable, articulable suspicion that a specific crime had occurred, was in the process of occurring, or was about to occur. Living on a park bench, regardless of one's race or attire, did not meet that standard. Miller's suspicion was a feeling, a bias, not a legally defensible position. "With all due respect, officer, it is not that simple," Grayson said, his tone still even, but now with a sharp, instructional edge. "Your report of suspicious activity is the basis for this interaction, but my current actions, sitting here, feeding birds, do not provide you with reasonable suspicion that I am the individual from that alleged report, nor that I am engaged in any criminal activity. Therefore, this is what the law defines as a consensual encounter." He paused, letting the legal term sink in. "And in a consensual encounter, I am not required to identify myself. I do not have to answer your questions, and I am free to leave at any time. So, unless you can articulate a specific crime you believe I have committed, I do not consent to this conversation. I do not consent to a search, and I will not be providing you with my identification. I am respectfully declining to cooperate with your unlawful inquiry." The air crackled with tension. Grayson had not raised his voice. He had not made a single threatening move. But with his words alone, he had drawn a clear, immovable line in the sand. A line defined by the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. He had taken Miller's script, torn it to shreds, and handed it back to him. For Miller, this was an unimaginable act of defiance. It was a direct assault on his authority, on his very identity as a police officer. No one talked to him like this. Criminals ran, liars stammered, and innocent people in his experience were always eager to comply, to prove their innocence. This calm, articulate refusal felt more threatening than any shouted insult. It felt superior. It made him feel small, foolish, and powerless. And Officer Dean Miller did not handle feeling powerless well. The flush on his neck deepened to a dark, angry crimson. The hunter had been challenged by his prey, and his instinct was not to retreat, but to attack. The challenge of wills had reached its breaking point. Officer Miller stared at Grayson, his mind racing. The old man's words were too precise, too confident. He had used terms like consensual encounter and articulate, reasonable suspicion. This wasn't the rambling of a vagrant. It was the language of a lawyer, or worse, a cop watcher, one of those activists who went around looking for confrontations. In Miller's black and white world, anyone who knew the law that well was automatically an adversary. They were the enemy. They used the rules as a weapon against him, and it was his job to put them back in their place. His initial lazy lie about a report of suspicious activity had been called out. Now he needed to double down. He needed to create a crime where none existed. "You're loitering," Miller declared, the words coming out as a blunt accusation. He latched onto the charge like a drowning man grabbing a life raft. It was a vague, catch-all offense often used to harass the homeless and disenfranchised. It was easily challenged in court, but on the street, in the moment, it was a powerful tool of intimidation. "This is a high-crime area, and you're sitting here with no legitimate purpose. That's loitering, and that gives me all the cause I need. Now, for the last time, give me your ID." Grayson almost sighed. The desperation in the officer's move was palpable. It was a classic escalation, a sign of an officer losing control and trying to regain it through brute force and flawed legal reasoning. He had seen young cops make this mistake countless times. They got their ego involved, and every semblance of good police work went out the window. It became a personal battle they had to win at any cost. "Officer," Grayson began, his voice taking on the patient tone of a professor correcting a promising but misguided student. "The city ordinance on loitering requires more than just being present in a public place. It requires the intent to commit a crime, or the obstruction of public passage. I am sitting peacefully on a bench designed for public use. I am not obstructing anyone. I am not preparing to commit a crime. I am, as I've stated, feeding birds. My purpose is recreation. Therefore, your accusation of loitering is legally unfounded." He looked directly into Miller's eyes, his gaze unwavering. "You are attempting to manufacture a crime to justify an illegal detention. Every word you say is being recorded by your own body camera. I suggest you think very carefully about your next action. You are on a very dangerous path, son." The word son landed like a spark on dry tinder. It was a term of admonishment, of condescension. It was the way a superior speaks to a subordinate. And in Miller's inflamed state of mind, it was the ultimate insult. Who was this old man to son him? He was the one with the badge, the gun, the authority. He was the law. This man was nothing, a nameless, faceless suspect who was now mocking him, lecturing him, making him look like a fool. The audience was growing. A woman walking a golden retriever had stopped a safe distance away, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. A couple of joggers on the far side of the path had slowed their pace, their heads turned toward the confrontation. Miller felt their eyes on him. He was on stage now. Retreat was no longer an option. Walking back to his cruiser would be an admission of defeat, a public humiliation. He had to win. He had to assert his dominance. He took another step forward, his hand now moving from the grip of his gun to his radio, a clear signal that this was escalating from a conversation to an official police action. "All right, you want to play lawyer? We can play. I'm done asking." His voice was cold, stripped of any pretense of professionalism. "You are now being detained for investigation of narcotics trafficking and failure to identify. Stand up, turn around and put your hands behind your back. You can explain your legal theories to the judge." It was a catastrophic miscalculation. He had fabricated a second, far more serious crime, narcotics trafficking, out of thin air. There was not a shred of evidence. It was a lie built upon a lie, a house of cards constructed from ego and prejudice. He had crossed a line from which there was no honorable return. Grayson heard the new charge and felt a deep, profound sadness. The young officer hadn't just made a mistake, he had destroyed his own career in the space of 3 minutes. And Grayson knew he was about to become the instrument of that destruction. A deep, weary sigh escaped Samuel Grayson's lips. It was not a sigh of fear or surrender, but of profound disappointment. He had given the young officer multiple opportunities to de-escalate, to walk away, to salvage the situation and his career. He had laid out the legal framework with the clarity of a textbook, hoping to appeal to the man's training, if not his common sense. But it was clear that Officer Miller was operating on a different frequency, one dominated by ego and the intoxicating hum of his own power. "Officer Miller," Grayson said, his voice calm but imbued with a new weight, a finality that was impossible to ignore. "I am going to give you one last opportunity. Get back in your vehicle and drive away. If you do, this encounter ends right here. No report, no complaint. We can pretend this never happened. But if you proceed with this course of action, I assure you it will be the single greatest regret of your professional life. Your choice." It was not a plea. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the chilling certainty of a man who knew exactly how the system worked because he had once commanded it. He was offering a final, unmerited act of grace. For Miller, however, it sounded like the most arrogant threat he had ever heard. The audacity of this man, to give him a final chance, to offer him a way out. The roles had been completely inverted. In Miller's mind, he was the one in control, the one with the power. This bum from the park was trying to bluff his way out of an arrest. It was pathetic. It was infuriating. "You're in no position to be giving anyone a chance," Miller sneered, his hand dropping from his radio and moving toward his handcuffs. The time for talking was over. "I gave you a lawful order. You refused. You failed to identify. You're obstructing my investigation." "Asserting my constitutional rights is not obstruction, officer," Grayson stated for the record, ensuring his voice was clear enough for the body camera and any other recording devices to capture. "The Supreme Court was very clear on that in Arizona versus Johnson. Your investigation is predicated on a baseless stop. Therefore, any charge of obstruction is invalid. You are building a case on a foundation of sand." "Shut up!" Miller barked, his professional composure now completely gone, replaced by raw, undisciplined anger. "I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by some jailhouse lawyer." He unsnapped the cuff case on his belt. The click of the button was a definitive sound, the point of no return. "Stand up now, or I will assist you." Grayson knew the moment had come. He could continue to sit, forcing the officer to physically remove him from the bench, which would only result in a more violent confrontation and potential injury. Or he could comply physically while maintaining his legal protest, preserving the evidence of the unlawful arrest without sacrificing his own safety. He was 68 years old. His days of wrestling with belligerent young men were long behind him. He chose the path of strategic compliance. Slowly, with the deliberate movements of a man whose joints ached in the cold, Grayson began to rise. "For the record," he announced, his voice projecting clearly across the park, "I am standing under duress. I am complying with your unlawful order to avoid physical harm. This is not consent. This is coercion." He stood to his full height. At 6'2", he was a few inches taller than Officer Miller, and his broad shoulders, even under the bulky coat, gave him a formidable presence. He did not look intimidated. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who was profoundly, deeply unimpressed. The sight of Grayson towering over him, calm and composed even in the face of arrest, was a final insult to Miller's fragile ego. He saw it as a challenge, a silent mockery. The law had failed to intimidate this man. Now it was time to see if pain would. About 40 feet away, Clara Jenkins tightened her grip on the leash of her golden retriever, Rusty. The dog, sensing his owner's anxiety, let out a low, questioning whine. Clara had stopped walking several minutes ago, initially just curious about the police interaction. Now, she was horrified. She was a middle-aged accountant, a woman who lived her life in spreadsheets and quiet suburban routines. She had always believed in respecting the police, in the fundamental idea that they were there to protect and serve. But what she was witnessing felt wrong. It felt like bullying. The older man had been the picture of tranquility, doing nothing more threatening than feeding ducks. The young officer had approached him like a storm front, his voice and posture radiating aggression from the very start. She had heard snippets of the conversation, words like rights and unlawful, spoken calmly by the older man, and angry, dismissive retorts from the officer. Now the officer had his handcuffs out. He was actually going to arrest this man for sitting on a bench. It was absurd. It was unjust. A decade ago, Clara would have just stood by, a silent, intimidated witness. She would have told herself it wasn't her business, that the police must know what they're doing. But things were different now. She had seen the videos. She had read the stories. She knew that a badge was not a guarantee of good intent, and that a camera could be the only thing standing between a citizen and a miscarriage of justice. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. Her fingers were clumsy with cold and nerves, but she managed to unlock the screen and open the camera app. She pressed the red record button. The small timer in the corner began to tick upwards. She held the phone steady, framing both men in the shot. "He hasn't done anything wrong," Clara called out, her voice stronger and clearer than she expected. "I've been watching. He's just been sitting there." Officer Miller's head snapped in her direction. His eyes were cold slits of fury. "Ma'am, this is an official police investigation. You need to step back. Do not interfere." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. He was trying to intimidate her into silence. But the act of starting the recording had emboldened Clara. She was no longer just a passive observer. She was a documentarian. She had a role to play. "I'm on public property, officer," she called back, taking a half step forward, not backward. "I have every right to be here, and I have every right to record this. You're the one being aggressive. Leave him alone." Grayson, who was now standing facing Miller, heard the woman's voice. He didn't turn to look at her, not wanting to escalate the situation further, but he offered a tiny, almost imperceptible nod in her general direction. He had spent years trying to build bridges between the community and the police, encouraging citizens to be active partners in public safety. This woman, this stranger with a phone, was the embodiment of that ideal. She was being a good citizen. She was holding power accountable. Her recording was now a crucial piece of evidence, a third independent narrative that would corroborate the official footage from his own dash cam and body cam. The presence of the camera, however, had the opposite of its intended effect on Miller. Instead of causing him to pause and reconsider his actions, it enraged him further. He felt trapped. He was being challenged by the suspect and now recorded by a bystander. In his mind, the whole world was turning against him, siding with the criminal. It was a siege, and when under siege, you don't retreat. You attack with overwhelming force. He turned his back on Clara, dismissing her as a nuisance, and focused his full, unrestrained anger on the man in front of him. The unblinking eye of the witness's camera would not deter him. It would only serve to capture his career's spectacular, self-inflicted implosion in high definition. The decision was made. There was no more deliberation, no more weighing of options. Officer Miller was operating on pure, unadulterated ego. The calm defiance of the old man, the defiant shouts of the woman with the camera, the silent judgment of the joggers. It had all coalesced into a singular, overwhelming need to prove them all wrong, to reassert his dominance in the most visceral way possible. He was the law, and he was about to demonstrate what happened when the law was disrespected. "Turn around," Miller commanded, his voice a low growl. He grabbed Grayson's arm, his grip unnecessarily tight. Grayson didn't resist, but he also didn't make it easy. He turned slowly, with a deliberate, almost regal slowness, forcing Miller to match his pace. "On what charge, officer?" Grayson asked, his voice steady. He was no longer trying to de-escalate. He was now building his legal case, ensuring every procedural error was captured on camera. "You need to inform me of the charges for this arrest." "Resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, failure to identify." Miller rattled off the charges as he spun Grayson around, shoving him slightly toward the park bench. The charges were a work of fiction, a circular and self-justifying logic that only made sense in the mind of an officer who had already lost control. He was arresting the man for refusing to cooperate with an investigation that had no legal basis. He was arresting him for resisting an unlawful arrest. Resisting an officer requires physical opposition or a threat of violence, Grayson said, speaking to the air, to the cameras, to the future jurors in a courtroom he could already envision. I have done neither. Asserting my rights is not obstruction, and failure to identify is not a standalone arrestable offense in this state, absent a lawful detention for another crime. Your entire basis for this arrest is legally void. I told you to shut your mouth, Miller yelled. He was done with the legal debate. He shoved Grayson forward, forcing him to bend over the back of the iron bench. The cold metal pressed against Grayson's thighs. Miller grabbed Grayson's left wrist and wrenched it behind his back. He didn't use a standard, Academy-approved technique designed for control and safety. Instead, he twisted the arm high up between Grayson's shoulder blades, a pain compliance technique meant to inflict discomfort and punish dissent. Grayson winced, a sharp intake of breath the only sound he made. A flare of pain shot through his shoulder, a joint made stiff by age and old injuries. He had taught recruits for years that such techniques were to be used only against actively resisting, violent suspects. To use it on a compliant elderly man was a clear and blatant act of excessive force. The first metallic click of the handcuff ratcheting shut echoed in the quiet park. Miller pulled the cuff brutally tight, the serrated steel biting into the thin skin of Grayson's wrist. He then grabbed the other arm, applying the second cuff with the same unnecessary roughness. "You're hurting him!" Clara shouted from the sidewalk, her voice trembling with outrage. "Stop it! He's not fighting you!" Miller ignored her. He had his man. He had won. He hauled Grayson upright, yanking him back by the chain of the handcuffs. He had crossed the Rubicon. He had initiated an arrest based on a false pretext, escalated it with fabricated charges, and executed it with excessive force, all while being recorded by multiple cameras, including his own. He had, in the span of less than 10 minutes, committed a series of professional and legal blunders so profound that they would be studied at the Academy for years to come as a perfect example of what not to do. But in that moment, standing under the pale winter sun, all he felt was the triumphant surge of victory. He had faced down a challenge to his authority and emerged the victor. He was a good cop. He had restored order. He had no idea that he had just arrested the very man who had once written the definition of order for the entire department. The cold steel of the handcuffs was a familiar sensation to Samuel Grayson, but always from the other side. He knew the weight of them, the precise sound of the double lock engaging, the standard procedure for checking the tightness by slipping a fingertip between the metal and the wrist. Officer Miller did none of this. He left the cuffs on the single lock, and they were cinched so tightly that Grayson could already feel the circulation in his hands beginning to protest. The sharp edges dug into his flesh, a constant throbbing reminder of the officer's unprofessional rage. It was a rookie mistake, and a dangerous one. But more than that, it was a deliberate act of humiliation. "Let's go," Miller grunted, grabbing Grayson by the bicep of his coat and pulling him away from the bench. The walk to the patrol car was not an escort. It was a forced march. Miller pushed him forward, keeping him slightly off balance, a tactic to maintain physical dominance over his prisoner. Grayson did not stumble. He held his head high, his back straight. His decades of training, of maintaining composure under extreme pressure, took over. He was no longer just a victim of an injustice. He was an observer, a professional analyst cataloging every failure in procedure. Violation 1. Failure to double-lock the handcuffs. This could lead to them tightening further during transport, causing nerve damage, and also allowed a suspect to potentially tamper with the lock. Violation 2. Excessive tightness of the cuffs. A clear violation of the department's use of force policy. Violation 3. Unprofessional escort. Pushing and pulling a compliant, non-resistant prisoner constituted unnecessary force. The list was growing longer with every step. "I have your badge number, officer," Clara yelled, trailing them from a safe distance, her phone still held high. 5 Baker 9. I've got it all recorded. My husband is a lawyer." Miller shot a venomous glare over his shoulder. "Go ahead, call him. Tell him to meet his new client at the 5th Precinct. he shouted back, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. He actually thought he was in the right. The depth of the young man's delusion was staggering. They reached the cruiser. Miller opened the rear door and shoved Grayson toward the opening. The back of a patrol car is an unforgiving space, a cramped cage of hard, molded plastic designed for durability, not comfort. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair. Grayson knew this model intimately. He had signed the purchase order for this fleet 5 years prior. "Watch your head," Miller did not say. Instead, he placed a hand on the top of Grayson's head and pushed down, forcing him into the car with a rough, dismissive shove. Grayson contorted his body, trying to maneuver his cuffed arms and aching shoulders into the tight space without further injury. He settled onto the hard plastic seat, the world outside now framed by a cage of thick wire mesh. Miller slammed the door, the sound a final, definitive boom. He walked around to the driver's side, radiating a swagger of accomplishment. He got in, started the engine with a roar, and cranked the heat, the vents blasting stale, warm air into the cabin. He didn't look back at his prisoner. He was too busy keying his shoulder mic. "Dispatch 5 Baker 9, he said, his voice full of official importance. "Show me en route to the precinct with one in custody. Adult male, non-compliant. Charges are resisting, obstruction, and failure to ID. We'll get his name at the station." Non-compliant, Grayson murmured to himself, the word a bitter irony. He had complied with every unlawful order to prevent the officer from escalating to deadly force. He had endured pain and humiliation with a stoicism born of decades of discipline. And this was the narrative the officer was creating, a non-compliant suspect. It was a lie, a self-serving fiction to cover a bad arrest. He looked out the window as the cruiser pulled away from the curb with a squeal of tires. He saw the spilled birdseed on the ground, a small, sad testament to the morning's shattered peace. He saw the woman, Clara, standing on the sidewalk, still holding her phone, a small beacon of civic duty in a sea of official misconduct. He had been stripped of his dignity, his freedom, and his name. In the eyes of Officer Miller, he was just another John Doe, another body to be processed, another statistic to bolster a young cop's career. The humiliation was complete. Before putting Grayson in the car, Miller had conducted a cursory, aggressive search. It was less a search for weapons and more an assertion of dominance, a final violation of Grayson's personal space. He patted down Grayson's legs and torso with hard, slapping motions. He plunged his hands into the deep outer pockets of the wool coat, his movements rough and intrusive. "What's this?" Miller had sneered, pulling out the small paper sack. He looked inside, saw the cracked corn and seeds, and with a roll of his eyes, he tossed it onto the grass. "Feeding the birds. Right." The gesture was pure contempt, dismissing Grayson's stated purpose for being in the park as a pathetic lie. Then, his hands found the inner breast pocket of the coat. He felt the firm, rectangular shape of a wallet. He pulled it out. It was a simple, unadorned black leather wallet, softened and worn with age, its corners rounded from years of being carried close to the heart. It was heavy with the unspoken history of the man who owned it. This was the moment. This was the junction where two timelines could diverge. In one timeline, Officer Miller, following standard procedure, would have opened the wallet right there to identify the man he was arresting. He would have flipped it open, and the first thing he would have seen, gleaming under the pale winter sun, would have been the recessed, gold-plated badge of a retired police commissioner. He would have seen the official identification card, bearing the name Samuel J. Grayson, with the title and photograph of a man in a crisp dress uniform, staring back at him with the same calm, disappointed eyes as the man standing before him. In that timeline, the blood would have drained from Miller's face. His entire world would have tilted on its axis right there on the gravel path. Humiliation, terror, and the sudden gut-wrenching realization of his catastrophic error would have overwhelmed him. But that is not what happened. In this timeline, Miller was blinded by an arrogance so profound it defied protocol, common sense, and self-preservation. He was on a power trip, and his prisoner was no longer a person. He was an object, a symbol of defiance that needed to be subdued and processed. The man's identity was irrelevant. He was a John Doe, a refusal, and Miller was going to make him pay for the inconvenience by dragging the process out. He held the wallet in his hand for a moment. It felt thick, substantial. He didn't open it. He simply glanced at it with disdain and then shoved it deep into the cargo pocket of his own tactical pants. "We'll figure out who you are down at the station," he had said with a smug finality. "Since you want to be difficult, you can wait. Maybe a few hours in a holding cell will help you remember your name." The wallet, the very object that contained the truth, the key that could have instantly unlocked his colossal mistake, was now in his possession, a ticking time bomb in his pocket. He was the warden carrying the key to his own prison cell, utterly oblivious to its significance. He was holding a piece of leather that was, in effect, a death warrant for his career, and he treated it like a piece of confiscated contraband. As he drove, the wallet was a heavy, forgotten lump against his thigh. He was too consumed with his own righteous narrative, too busy planning how he would write up the report to make himself look like the hero, to give it a second thought. He didn't know that he was driving the physical embodiment of the department's history and legacy to a booking desk where that legacy was revered. He didn't know that the simple act of opening that wallet would have saved him. But his pride, his anger, and his prejudice had sealed his fate. The wallet of damnation rested in his pocket, waiting patiently for the moment of its revelation, a moment that was now, with every rotation of the cruiser's tires drawing inevitably closer. The drive from Crestwood Park to the 5th Precinct was 15 minutes of escalating hubris. For Officer Miller, the arrest was complete, the victory secured. Now came the lecture. He seemed to need to fill the silence, to verbally reinforce the justification for his actions, not for Grayson's benefit, but for his own. He looked up, catching Grayson's eye in the rearview mirror. "You see, this is the problem with guys like you," Miller began, his tone a condescending drawl. "You walk around with this chip on your shoulder, thinking the rules don't apply to you. You think you're smarter than everyone else. But let me tell you how it works out here on the street. It's about respect." Grayson stared back at the reflection of the young officer's eyes. They were alight with a self-satisfied gleam. He remained silent, letting the man talk, letting him dig his own hole deeper with every word. "You give respect, you get respect," Miller continued, as if reciting a fortune cookie philosophy. "You see a police officer, you show respect for the badge. You answer a simple question, you show your ID. The whole thing takes 30 seconds and everyone goes on their way. But you had to make it difficult. You had to give me attitude. You give me attitude, you get the bracelets. It's cause and effect. Simple as that." Grayson felt a cold, analytical detachment settle over him. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was observing a specimen, a case study in failed policing. The officer's monologue was a masterclass in projection and self-deception. "Respect is earned, officer. It is not an automatic entitlement of the uniform," Grayson finally said, his voice quiet but clear, easily cutting through the noise of the engine. "And authority is a trust granted to you by the people you serve. It is not a weapon to be used to win arguments." Miller scoffed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "I'm not here to win arguments. I'm here to keep the streets safe. You fit a profile. It's my job to investigate. High crime area, baggy clothes, no reason to be there. That's textbook. If you had nothing to hide, you wouldn't have hesitated to show me who you are. Innocent people don't act the way you acted." The flawed logic was breathtaking. The presumption of guilt was the foundation of his entire worldview. "The Fourth Amendment was written precisely to protect the innocent from unwarranted government intrusion," Grayson replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. "It is not a privilege for the guilty. I don't show my identification on demand because I live in a constitutional republic, not a police state. And my coat is not a profile, officer. It is a garment. You saw what you wanted to see, a potential criminal. You saw my skin color and my location, and you built a fantasy around it. There was nothing else." Yeah, save the speech for your public defender, Miller shot back, waving a dismissive hand. He was tired of the game. He had already won. You're going to the precinct. You're going to get processed, fingerprinted, and photographed. And you're going to sit in a holding cell until you decide you're ready to tell us your name. Maybe a night in the tank with the real winners will improve your attitude. Grayson broke eye contact with the mirror and turned his head to look out the side window. The city slid by, a blur of brick and glass. He closed his eyes. He wasn't surrendering. He was memorizing. He was cementing the details in his mind. Badge number 7241, Cruiser 5, Baker 9. Time of arrest, approximately 9:45 a.m. He thought about the young man in the front seat. He was so confident, so sure of his power, so utterly clueless that his career was already over. He just hadn't received the official notification yet. There was a tragedy in it, Grayson thought. A waste of a uniform, a waste of training, a waste of a salary paid by the very citizens he was abusing. All because of a fragile ego, an inability to admit a mistake, and a refusal to see a human being instead of a stereotype. The ride to reckoning was almost over. For Miller, it would be an awakening. For Grayson, it was just a return home. The 5th Precinct building loomed ahead, a formidable structure of concrete and dark-tinted glass built in the early 80s. It was a brutalist fortress designed to project strength and impenetrability. Grayson knew every inch of it. In 2008, as deputy commissioner, he had overseen the project that gutted and renovated the interior, transforming its dark, cramped corridors into brighter, more efficient workspaces. He had lobbied the city council for months to secure the funding, arguing that a station house should be a place of organized professionalism, not a dungeon. His portrait, a formal photograph taken the year he was promoted to commissioner, hung in the main lobby, just to the right of the public entrance. He wondered if Officer Miller had ever bothered to look at it. As Miller turned the cruiser down the ramp into the subterranean sally port, the heavy steel gate began to roll down behind them with a deep, grinding groan. The sound echoed in the concrete garage, a definitive clang of finality. They were inside, sealed off from the outside world. "End of the line, pal," Miller announced with a cheerful finality that grated on Grayson's nerves. "Time to get you checked into your new accommodations." Miller got out and opened Grayson's door, hauling him out of the back seat with the same roughness he had displayed in the park. Grayson's legs were stiff from the cramped ride, and the over-tightened handcuffs had turned his hands into numb, tingling claws. He stood up, stretching his back as best he could, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings of the garage. He saw the designated parking spots for the sergeants, the caged area for evidence processing, the heavy steel door that led to the booking room. It was all just as he had left it. Miller grabbed him by the arm again, marching him toward that steel door. As they walked, Grayson's mind drifted back. He remembered standing in this very garage, congratulating a class of newly promoted detectives. He remembered conducting a late-night inspection after a riot, the air thick with the smell of sweat and exhaustion. This building wasn't just a place of work, it was a monument to his life's dedication. Every brick seemed to hold an echo of his own voice, his own decisions. He had poured his soul into this department, into shaping it into a force that was professional, accountable, and just. And now, he was being dragged through it like a common criminal by a young officer who embodied the very attitudes he had fought so hard to eradicate. The irony was so thick he could taste it. He wondered who was working the booking desk. The sergeant's post was the nerve center of the precinct, the gatekeeper. A good desk sergeant knew every cop, every rule, and every nuance of the job. A good sergeant could spot a bad arrest from a mile away. If it was a younger guy, one of the new generation, this humiliating charade might drag on for a while. But if it was one of the old guard, a veteran who had come up through the ranks with him, if it was Frank Rizzo or old Sergeant Kowalski, then the fireworks were about to begin. He hoped it was Rizzo. Frank had a flair for the dramatic. They reached the steel door. Miller swiped his key card, and a loud buzz unlocked the mechanism. He pushed the door open and shoved Grayson through into the bright, cacophonous world of the booking area. The ride was over. The reckoning was here. The booking room of the 5th Precinct was a controlled chaos of noise and activity. Phones rang with a shrill insistence. 2 officers were hunched over keyboards, typing out reports with methodical, 2-fingered concentration. The air was thick with the smell of industrial-strength coffee, floor cleaner, and the faint, underlying scent of human anxiety. In the corner, a man was being breathalyzed, his drunken protests slurring into incoherence. It was the messy, beating heart of the station, and presiding over it all from behind a high, plexiglass-shielded counter was Desk Sergeant Frank Rizzo. Rizzo was a precinct fixture, a man who seemed to have been born in his uniform. He was nearing 60 with a stout build, a magnificent gray mustache that was perpetually out of regulation, and the weary, all-seeing eyes of a man who had witnessed every form of human folly. He had been a sergeant for 20 years, turning down promotions to lieutenant because he loved the action of the front desk. He was the precinct's institutional memory, its conscience, and its immovable gatekeeper. At that moment, he was squinting at a file on his desk, his reading glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. "Got a live one for you, Sarge," Officer Miller announced, his voice booming with unearned pride. He propelled Grayson forward, stopping him in front of the high counter like a hunter presenting his kill. "Found this guy loitering down at Crestwood. Refused to ID, started spouting off about his rights, the whole 9 yards. Gave me a real hard time. We got him for obstruction and resisting." Rizzo didn't look up immediately. He meticulously finished reading the paragraph in front of him, then made a neat, precise note in the margin with a pen. He was not a man to be hurried. The swagger in Miller's voice was familiar to him. It was the sound of a young cop who valued arrests over justice, who confused authority with wisdom. Rizzo had seen 100 Millers come and go. "All right, Miller, calm down," Rizzo grumbled without making eye contact. "Bring him over to the bench. Empty his pockets onto the counter. You know the procedure." "Already did the preliminary search, Sarge," Miller said, puffing out his chest slightly. "Got his wallet right here." With a flourish, he reached into his cargo pocket, pulled out the worn black leather wallet, and slapped it down on the counter. The sound was a loud, definitive smack on the linoleum surface. "He wouldn't open it for me. Wants to play John Doe." Rizzo finally initialed the document in front of him, closing the file with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire city. "Okay, let's see what we've got here. Maybe his picture will be on the post office wall," he said, his voice laced with the dry, cynical humor of a career cop. He pushed his chair back, reached for the wallet, and finally lifted his head. And the world stopped. For a fraction of a second, Rizzo's brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. The ambient noise of the room, the ringing phones, the typing, the drunk man's mumbling, seemed to fade into a distant, irrelevant hum. He saw the man standing before him, the heavy wool coat, the beanie pulled low, the gray-streaked beard. But it was the eyes that hit him. He knew those eyes. They were eyes that had stared him down in promotion interviews, eyes that had offered quiet encouragement after a tough case, eyes that had surveyed a room full of commanders and, without a single word, commanded absolute respect. Rizzo's own eyes widened. He squinted, as if trying to bring a fuzzy image into focus. He whipped the reading glasses off his nose. The face was older, more lined than he remembered, the beard a new addition. But there was no mistake. It was him. "Commissioner," Rizzo whispered. The word was a breath, a ghost of a sound, barely audible over the din of the room. Miller, oblivious, let out a short, derisive laugh. "Commissioner? Yeah, right, Sarge. Commissioner of the park bench. This guy's just another bum giving us a hard time." And that's when it happened. Sergeant Frank Rizzo slammed his open palm down on the booking counter with a force that rattled every pen, stapler, and paperclip on its surface. The sound was like a gunshot, a thunderclap that instantly silenced the entire room. Every officer froze, every conversation stopped. Every head turned toward the front desk. Rizzo surged to his feet, his chair screeching backward against the tiled floor. His face, normally a placid mask of weary competence, was now a terrifying canvas of disbelief, fury, and dawning horror. It shifted from pale white to a deep mottled purple. He pointed a trembling sausage-like finger at Miller. "Miller!" he roared, his voice an explosion that echoed off the concrete walls. "You will take those handcuffs off of him right this second. Do you hear me? Right now!" Officer Miller froze, a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. He stared at Sergeant Rizzo, his mind struggling to comprehend the sudden violent shift in the atmosphere. One second he was the conquering hero. The next he was the target of a rage so pure and powerful it seemed to suck the air out of the room. "Sarge, what are you talking about?" Miller stammered, genuinely bewildered. "He's a suspect. He resisted. I said, get them off!" Rizzo bellowed, leaning so far over the counter it seemed he might vault it. The veins in his neck stood out like thick cords. "That is Police Commissioner Samuel Grayson, you goddamn idiot! Are you out of your mind?" The name hung in the dead, silent air. Commissioner Samuel Grayson. Miller's head snapped from Rizzo to the man in handcuffs. He looked, truly looked, for the first time. He looked past the wool coat, past the beanie, past the narrative of a vagrant he had constructed in his mind. He saw the man's face, the strong jawline, the piercing intelligence in his eyes, the unwavering calm. And then, as if drawn by an invisible string, his gaze drifted past Grayson to the wall behind the booking desk. There, in a large, polished wooden frame, was the official portrait gallery of the 5th Precinct's former captains and citywide commissioners who had started their careers there. And in the most prominent position was the portrait of a man in a dress blue uniform, adorned with 4 gold stars on the collar. The man in the picture was younger, clean-shaven, his hair darker. But the eyes were the same. The stern, dignified expression was the same. It was the man he had just dragged in, the man currently standing in his custody. The collapse was instantaneous and total. The floor seemed to fall away from beneath Miller's feet, plunging him into a dizzying, nauseating abyss of pure terror. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. His mouth went dry. A cold sweat erupted on his forehead. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. I didn't... The words caught in his throat. "Unlock him," Grayson said. It was the first time he had spoken since entering the precinct. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. It was the quiet, absolute voice of command. Miller's hands began to shake violently. He fumbled at his belt for the handcuff key, his fingers suddenly thick and useless. He dropped the key. It clattered onto the linoleum floor, the small metallic sound amplified 100 times in the cavernous silence. He scrambled to pick it up, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He was hyperventilating. He finally managed to grasp the key, his shaking hand struggling to fit it into the lock on Grayson's left wrist. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the young, arrogant hunter was reduced to a trembling, pathetic mess. Click. The first cuff sprang open. He moved to the right wrist. His hand was shaking so badly he couldn't guide the key into the small hole. "Allow me, sir," Sergeant Rizzo said, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and mortification. He came around the desk, snatched the key from Miller's hand, and with a swift, practiced movement, unlocked the second cuff. Click. Grayson was free. He brought his hands forward, rubbing his wrists. Deep, angry red welts circled his skin where the steel had bitten into him. He looked down at the marks, his expression unreadable. Then he lifted his head and looked directly at the shell-shocked Officer Miller. The universe of consequences that was about to descend upon the young man was all there, unspoken, in that single, devastating gaze. Miller's world hadn't just collapsed, it had been annihilated. "Sergeant Rizzo," Grayson said, his voice still quiet, yet it commanded the attention of every person in the room. "Yes, Commissioner." "Sir," Rizzo replied, his posture ramrod straight. He looked like he was ready to stand at attention for a week. "Sir, on behalf of this precinct, I am so sorry. I don't know what this officer was thinking." "Secure Officer Miller's service weapon, badge, and identification," Grayson ordered, his tone leaving no room for discussion. He was no longer a retired civilian, he was the commissioner again, his authority reasserting itself as naturally as breathing. "He is hereby relieved of duty, pending a full internal affairs investigation into unlawful detention, battery, excessive force, and multiple civil rights violations." Miller stumbled back a step, as if he'd been physically struck. "Wait! You can't do that!" he gasped, his voice a pathetic squeak. "You're retired! I followed protocol. He wouldn't identify himself." "Rizzo," Grayson said again, his eyes still locked on Miller. Rizzo didn't hesitate for a second. He turned to the now ashen-faced Miller. "You heard him. Gun and shield on the counter. Now!" The sheer force of the commotion, Rizzo's initial roar, the ensuing silence, and the palpable tension had finally drawn the attention of the command staff upstairs. The door to the administrative offices flew open, and Captain Evans, the precinct commander, came rushing out, followed closely by the current police commissioner, David Henderson. Henderson was in his late 40s, a man Grayson had mentored for years, promoting him from lieutenant to captain and eventually recommending him for the top job when he retired. "What in God's name is going on down here?" Henderson demanded, his eyes sweeping the bizarre tableau. He saw his officers standing frozen like statues. He saw Sergeant Rizzo looking apoplectic. He saw a young officer, Miller, looking like he was about to faint. And then he saw him. Standing in the middle of it all, rubbing bruised wrists, was his predecessor, his friend, his mentor, Samuel Grayson. "Sam," Henderson breathed, rushing forward. "My God, what happened? Are you okay?" "I've been better, David," Grayson said, his tone dry. "It seems one of your officers decided that the Fourth Amendment was an optional guideline this morning." Commissioner Henderson's head snapped toward Miller, his expression shifting from confusion to a cold, hard fury that was far more terrifying than Rizzo's explosive rage. "Officer Miller, my office, now," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Sir, I can explain," Miller stammered. "I made a stop. In the park. He was a suspicious person. He refused to give me his ID, so I arrested him for obstruction." "Did you have reasonable suspicion, officer?" Henderson asked, his voice like ice. "Did you witness a crime? Articulate it for me. Now." He was wearing a heavy coat," Miller said, his voice cracking. "It looked suspicious. He was just sitting there." "He was feeding the ducks, David," Grayson interrupted, his voice cutting through Miller's pathetic explanation. "I was sitting on a public bench enjoying my retirement. Your officer approached me with immediate hostility, lied about receiving a report of criminal activity, refused to articulate a specific crime, and when I asserted my constitutional rights, he arrested me for it." Henderson's gaze fell upon the black leather wallet sitting on the booking counter. He picked it up. He opened it. He pulled out the retired commissioner's credentials and badge. He looked at Miller, his eyes burning with disbelief. "You arrested him for failure to identify," Henderson stated, each word a hammer blow. "While you had his identification in your pocket the entire time? You never even looked?" I was going to process it at the desk, sir." "You arrested a man and deprived him of his liberty for nearly an hour, and you couldn't be bothered to take 2 seconds to look in his wallet?" Henderson shook his head, a look of utter disgust on his face. "That is deprivation of rights under color of law, Miller. That is a federal offense. You're not just losing your job, you might be going to prison." He turned to Rizzo. "Sergeant, take Officer Miller to interview room 1. Get his union rep on the phone. Tell them it's a gross misconduct case and to get here immediately. He is not to speak to anyone else." "Yes, sir," Rizzo said. He took Miller by the arm, firmly but professionally, and led the shell-shocked, zombie-like officer away. As he walked, Dean Miller's entire life flashed before his eyes. The academy graduation, the pride on his parents' faces, the sense of purpose he thought he had. All of it, gone. Evaporated in a single, stupid, ego-driven encounter in the park. The unraveling of his authority was complete. Commissioner Henderson turned back to Grayson, his face a mask of profound apology and professional embarrassment. "Sam, come on upstairs, let's get some coffee. Get some ice for those wrists. We can—" "No, David." Grayson held up a hand, stopping him. The authority was still there, effortless and absolute. "We're not going upstairs. We're not handling this as friends. We're handling this as a matter of official record. I want this documented right here, right now. I want the body camera and dash cam footage from Officer Miller's vehicle pulled and secured immediately, before it has a chance to be accidentally corrupted or erased." "Sam, you know we wouldn't do that," Henderson said, a hint of hurt in his voice. "I know you wouldn't, David," Grayson said, his tone softening slightly. "But I also know how the blue wall of silence works. The system is designed to protect its own. And today, I wasn't the former commissioner. I was just a black man in a heavy coat. If I hadn't been me, if I had been some 19-year-old kid from the neighborhood who didn't know the law, what would have happened? He'd be in a cell right now facing a resisting charge that could follow him for the rest of his life, all because a cop had a bad feeling. So no, we are not sweeping 1 inch of this under the rug." "We won't," Henderson promised, his voice firm. "I'll initiate a Level 1 internal affairs investigation myself. It will be thorough, and it will be transparent." "Good," Grayson nodded. "Now I believe you offered me some ice." The fallout was as swift as it was brutal. The video from Clara Jenkins's phone, sent by her lawyer husband to a local news station, went viral within hours. Millions of people across the country watched the footage of a calm, elderly man being harassed and roughly arrested by an aggressive young officer for the crime of feeding ducks. When the news broke the following day that the man in the video was none other than the city's revered former police commissioner, the story exploded onto the national stage. The department was thrown into a firestorm of public outrage and media scrutiny. The official body camera footage, released by Henderson in an act of full transparency, was even more damning for Dean Miller. It captured his sneering tone, his blatant lies about a non-existent police report, his complete lack of legal justification, and his unprofessional rage. It was a textbook case of a power trip gone wrong. 3 weeks later, following the internal affairs investigation, Dean Miller was terminated from the police force. The review board found him guilty of 14 separate departmental policy violations, ranging from procedural errors to gross misconduct and excessive force. His certification to work as a law enforcement officer in the state was permanently revoked. He was unemployable in the only profession he had ever known. But Samuel Grayson didn't stop there. He filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city and the police department. It was never about the money. It was about forcing systemic change. "If this can happen to me, a man who once ran this entire department," he told a throng of reporters on the courthouse steps, "then I want you to imagine what is happening every single day to people who don't have my resources, my knowledge, or my name." The city, facing an unwinnable case backed by irrefutable video evidence, quickly settled for a substantial sum. Grayson didn't keep a penny of the $750,000 settlement. He used it to create the Grayson Legal Defense Fund, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing elite legal representation to citizens who had been victims of unlawful stops, illegal searches, and police misconduct. His ordeal had been transformed into a shield for others. A few months later, spring had begun to breathe life back into the city. The last remnants of winter had melted away, and the pond at Crestwood Park was a brilliant, shimmering blue under the warm sun. Samuel Grayson sat on his usual bench. He wore a lighter jacket now, but he still had a small paper bag of seeds beside him. He tossed a handful toward the water, and the ducks, his faithful morning companions, scurried forward. The system, he mused, is a machine. It is built from the cold steel of laws and the warm, fallible flesh of people. The laws, for the most part, are sound, but the people are a different story. Officer Miller wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom. He was the product of a culture that sometimes valued aggression over empathy, and a personal insecurity that made him mistake a challenge to his ego for a threat to his life. What could have been done differently? Perhaps if Grayson had immediately announced who he was, the confrontation would have ended. But that would have only been a victory for him, not for the principles he held dear. It would have reinforced the idea that there are two sets of rules, one for the powerful and one for everyone else. What if he had simply shown his ID? It would have validated an unlawful stop and taught Officer Miller that his illegal tactics worked. No, the path he took, as painful and humiliating as it was the only one that could lead to meaningful change. Miller's downfall wasn't caused by Grayson's refusal to comply. It was caused by Miller's refusal to listen, to learn, and to treat a fellow citizen with the basic dignity the badge demands. The badge is a heavy weight. Grayson knew that better than anyone. It can be a shield to protect the innocent, or a hammer to crush the vulnerable. It all comes down to the heart of the person wearing it. He watched the ducks squabble happily over the seeds, and for the first time in a long time he felt a flicker of hope. He had retired from the force, yes, but as long as there were citizens like Clara Jenkins with a camera and a conscience, and as long as his fund could give a voice to the voiceless, his watch wasn't really over. What do you think of the outcome? Was Officer Miller's punishment sufficient, or do you believe he should have faced criminal charges as well? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone in a position of authority let their ego get the best of them? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you and made you think about the delicate balance of power and responsibility in our society, please hit that like button and share it with others. These conversations matter. Subscribe for more stories that explore the truths hidden behind the uniform and the headlines. I'll see you in the next one.